Is this mic working? Okay, that's good. Please raise your hands if you cannot hear me. I guess people can hear me. See, it always works. So, the reason people started asking me to give speeches was because of my work in the free software movement and developing the GNU operating system, which most people have mistakenly come to think of as Linux. You don't hear so much about free software nowadays. And the reason is that lots of people decided not to even mention the term free software, and they talk about open source instead. Now, there's a big difference between free software and open source. A big difference at the level of philosophy. You see, free software is a movement for human rights for software users. We believe that every software user is entitled to 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so that it does what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor. That's the freedom to distribute copies of the program to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community, which is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. If a program gives you all 4 of these freedoms, it's free software, which means the social system of its distribution and use is an ethical system respecting the user's freedom. But if one of these freedoms is missing, then the program is proprietary software, user-subjugating software, non-free software, which means that the social system of its distribution and use does not respect your freedom. So a proprietary program imposes on the users the power of the developer. The developer keeps the users divided and helpless. And this is an injustice that we in the free software movement hope to put an end to. Now, talking about right and wrong makes a lot of businesses uncomfortable. They don't want their actions to be judged by any ethical standard. They want their actions to be judged only in terms of profit. When they offer something to the public, they don't want the public to ask themselves, does this respect my freedom? They want the public to think of it only in terms of what job can I do with it and how much does it cost? They want to deal with consumers, not with citizens. So those companies don't like talking about free software, and they have another term, open source, which they use instead. It's a way that they can avoid raising the ethical issues of the free software movement. And because of that, these ethical ideas now have to struggle to be heard. But they are sometimes heard. And I think the number of people aware of them is increasing, thanks sometimes to the help of some of you here. So, as the free software of the GNU plus Linux operating system came to be known, and as people started to hear about these free software packages, even if they don't know about free software, they started inviting me to give more speeches about the ideas of the free software movement and GNU. And sometimes at the end of a speech, someone would ask, well, do these ideas apply to anything else? How about computers, or microphones, or tables and chairs, or cars? Now that's a smart aleck question. It's a silly question, because it's really just inviting people to misunderstand it. Because he didn't really mean the same definition of free. Let's try seeing whether the same question makes sense for physical objects, like, say, cars or chairs. Well, what does it mean for something to be free? It means the users have the 4 freedoms. Well, freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program. Well, that would be the freedom to use the object. If it's yours, you're free to use it, normally. And what about freedom 1, the freedom to study the source code and change it to make the program do what you wish? Well, there's no source code for physical objects in general. There might be plans, but that's not the same thing. There's nothing to automatically compile the plans into the object. Now, you can study and modify the object itself to a certain extent, more or less depending on what it is. If it's a car, there are a lot of things you could do to it. If it's a chip, you can't modify it at all. To modify a chip destroys it. No one can do that. So, well, that freedom you have more or less as much as it's physically feasible. What about freedom 2, the freedom to make copies and distribute them to others? Well, there are no copiers, so that's a moot point. It's a meaningless question. And likewise, freedom 3, the freedom to copy and distribute your modified versions. Again, there are no copiers, so you can't do that. There's no way to do that. If you wanted more of them, you'd have to build them one by one and modify them. So the answer is physical objects are as free as they could be, given the limits of the physical world and our technology as it is today. So that smart aleck question doesn't really mean anything. But there are other things for which it is a meaningful question, namely other kinds of works made out of information that you might have in your computer. Those can be copied. Those can be modified. And so it's meaningful to ask, to what extent should people have the freedom to do it? It's a meaningful question. Now, if you have a work other than a program, then in general the only thing that's going to limit your freedom to do any of those things is copyright law. Programs are a special case. They're often restricted by end-user license agreements, which are contracts. But other kinds of works usually are just covered by copyright law. So to ask what freedoms we should have in using published works is another way of asking what copyright law should say about them. Now, people who have raised copyright issues with you before have probably got the question totally confused by equating copyright to, quote, intellectual property, unquote. In order to prevent that term from confusing the issue, I want to explain why it's confused. That term literally refers to copyright law and a bunch of other laws